And I think that we've established then that there are reasons to use digital. If you want something perfect, if there's a whole list of reasons to use digital, there's a whole list of reasons to use analog, which means that hybrid mixing is a very effective way to go. Hybrid mixing meaning that you're using some plugins in the box, and then you're sending that audio out through some analog gear, bringing it back in, maybe doing some more with plugins. When you're doing that, however, you're going to be sending from digital to analog, analog to digital, back and forth, and you're going to be running through an A to D converter and a D to A converter, probably repeatedly. With that being said, what is the importance of a high quality converter in a hybrid mixing setup?
Okay, so I'll start with the application side. So basically, every pass you do, you're going to be adding noise and distortion. And the problem with converter distortion, it's typically not the nice kind of distortion. It's clipping filters, clipping in converters, or even worse, full scale digital clipping is bad. It doesn't sound good. You just converter distortion is typically not nice. There are exceptions, but it's typically not very nice. And then noise floor as well. So every pass you do is probably going to add a little bit of noise, depending, because 140 dB is a perfect. 24-bit audio can do 140 dB, but you're not going to get any converter that has 140 dB of usable range. So you'll be squashing the dynamic range. And the thing is, you don't need, take the 500 R8. The 500 R8 has 121 dB signal noise ratio, 121 dB dynamic range. I mean, that's so much. You could do many passes before noise starts becoming an issue. But if you're using a converter that only has 100 dB of dynamic range or 105 dB of dynamic range, every pass you do, it's going to build the noise floor. And let alone before we even discuss distortion. So, the 500 R8 achieves a THD number of like 112 dB THD plus N. That's lower than some interfaces noise floors, dynamic range. If you want to avoid converter distortion, that's the other really important number to look at is converter THD. So I would say 110 or above is kind of what you want for really high-end conversion, high-end mixing and mastering conversion. But if you're going to do multiple passes of hybrid mixing, you definitely want to make sure you use something that achieves that. Now, the nice thing is converters have gotten so much better over the years. Even entry-level converters these days are pretty decent, But obviously, you get what you pay for. So really high-end converters will make the difference. They will introduce less distortion, and they'll have more dynamic range.
Whether you're using analog or digital, the acoustics of your space will have a huge impact on sound quality. Get free instructions for building your own acoustic panels at audiouniversityonline.com/acoustic panel blueprint. And like you said, if you're just doing one microphone, it's probably not going to be that big of a deal. But if you're doing 32 tracks, if you're sending those tracks in and out of the DAW, quantizing and converting back to analog again and again, these things can start to add up. And that also actually reminds me of another feature in your 500 chassis, the chain switch that sort of allows you to send out once to an analog device, and then instead of coming back in and sending back out to the next analog device, you can just chain those two together and sort of make a channel strip so that you have one conversion that goes out to the analog domain. You go through the analog gear you want to use, and then you convert it back only once. That also has some implications for latency as well, of course.
Well, and what I love most about the chain switch is that it gives you an undo. Like, for instance, let's say you have 3 500 series slots. You have a preamp, an EQ, and a compressor in that order. Chain. But you can record all 3 tracks. So you can record just the preamp, then you can record the preamp and the EQ, and then you can record the preamp, the EQ, and the compressor. And then it's like an undo later in your recording. So that's why, like, I talked earlier about how I track with compression and EQ now, but that's why. I mean, I have an R8 and ADAT when I'm recording, and I'll just record all the channels. If I'm recording a vocalist, I'll have the preamp, and plus EQ, and I'll have the preamp, EQ, and compressor. If I overcook the compressor, no big deal. Go back to the preamp and the EQ. But the cool thing is I would have gotten the performance from the vocalist with the compression, because especially vocalists, like, they will respond to the compression, they like good vocalists, especially, they're very mindful of how they sound. So the performance will change. I've had it where I used to do it the other way, where I used to record super clean, and you get a good performance, especially when you have a good musician. That's, musicians make the best recordings, let's face it. But when you get a recording that, especially if you want to get soul into something, or if you want to bring it to that next level, well, applying analog gear and getting them a sound immediately, the performer getting them a sound which boldens them and makes them feel good and makes them, wow, I can't believe how good I sound, and I can interact with it. For instance, like there's some compressors that add a little bit of 6K, 7K, which is like the S's in their voice. That could sound good, that could sound bad. Other compressors have a lot of body at 2K, which will inspire some singers and say, wow, I can really belt this part out. So it's crucial to the performance as well. So yeah, that's why the chain feature is so great, I think, as well. But one of the things that we were talking about with the converter specs and stuff, Kyle, is you don't have to do multiple passes. You can do the whole chain all at once on one converter pass and save your dynamic range and your THD and everything for the mixing stage. Another thing you mentioned about when you're doing the converter specs come into play when you're doing multiple passes and stuff like that. Actually, they even come into play with plugins, because plugins have oversampling and stuff like that. So that out of band noise that Ed was showing, that can come into play on plugins as well. Plugins that do oversampling and push the Nyquist up and do more out of band, processing where intermodulation distortion becomes an issue and stuff like that. So, you have a converter which has more of that high frequency noise and that kind of stuff. That could affect your plugins, that use oversampling and high frequency kind of sampling and stuff like that. So just generally speaking, the better the quality of your converter signal is, it's downstream. Everything from that point on will be cleaner, more dynamic, and you can do more passes and you can do more processing without artifacts becoming an issue.